So the big question is, how does CSS work? Well, in CSS we make declarations. Declarations consist of a property and a value. You can think of properties as the names of the styles that we want to change. Color is an example of a property that we've already used to change the color of text inside of an HTML element. The value in this case is the color itself that we've chosen for the text. Some properties only have a few values to choose from. For example, the text-align property has values of left, right, center, and a few more. Choosing one of these values will move your text inside the element to either the left, right, or center of the element. Very similar to how you can align a paragraph to the left, right, or center of a page in a text editor like Microsoft Word. Other properties, such as the color property that we already mentioned, have nearly infinite choices for values. There's over 16 million colors for us to choose from. But don't worry about that. We'll learn to choose our colors in a later lesson. In fact, because there are so many CSS properties and values, I don't want you to even try and memorize every single one of them. We'll be using anywhere from dozens to hundreds of different properties when we're building our own web pages, and we'll be able to look them up when we need them if we don't remember the right ones. Every developer currently working for a business always has access to documentation while they work, plus the ability to Google anything that they've forgotten. Some of the more progressive businesses might even let you ask an AI, such as ChatGPT, for explanations of CSS properties or values. If you have access to one, I'd encourage you to try asking an AI after you've already tried and failed to solve the problem yourself at least once. Remember, we only get better with practice, so relying on Google or an AI to write your code for you slows down your own personal progress and your own rate of learning. You won't really understand the material if you have someone or something else write the code rather than you. Now let's go a little more in depth on properties. There are several hundred CSS properties in total. You can use any property with any element, although some of them will have no effect if used incorrectly. Consider an image element that displays the photo of a cat on your web page. If you set the color property to blue on that image, nothing will break, but also the photo of the cat isn't going to change. The CSS color property will only change the color of text inside of an element, and your image element is only a photo. There's no text to change. So in this case, nothing will break, but also the property won't have any effect on the photo that the browser renders on your screen. I've included a link to all of the CSS properties on this slide and in the lesson references text beneath this video. Click on the link and you'll see a reference of every single CSS property. Some are used frequently, and we'll be practicing those common properties in later CSS lessons. Others are almost never used. These properties can change both the styles of text inside of our HTML elements and also the layout and style of the elements themselves. When I say that CSS properties can change the style of our text, I mean things like the color property that we've already used. In this example, the color property makes our text red. When I say that CSS properties can change the layout of our elements, I mean things like the display property. In this example, the CSS display property can make the children of this div, the paragraph elements, appear vertically or horizontally on the page. Now what about values? Most properties only have a few values. A few properties like the color property and the font size property can have nearly infinite values. This makes sense though, because there's basically infinite shades of color for you to choose from. And you could technically make the size of your text as large as you wanted, although at a certain point the letters become absurdly large and difficult to read. Whenever we look up a property on MDN, it will list out all of the values for that property. Flip back over to MDN and let's see an example of that. Find the text decoration line property and click on it. On the web page, we see a description of the property. We also see examples of its usage. You can click on multiple different examples to try them out. Beneath that, we see a section called Syntax. All of the possible values for this property are listed in this section along with descriptions of their usage and effects. Now that we know where to find properties and their values, let's try this property out in Replit. Make a new REPL and name it whatever you want. I'm going to call this one Learning CSS. Delete the script.js file and the style.css file. Then delete everything inside of the index.html file. Click the Run button and we should have a blank page. Now what comes first in an HTML document? The preamble. Go ahead and add your doc type preamble on line 1. What comes after that? Our root element. That's the HTML element, the one that literally has the letters H, T, M, and L inside of it. What always goes in the root element? First the head element, and second the body element. Add both of those, and that's it for the required elements. Now go ahead and make a paragraph element. Pop quiz. Should we put it in the head or the body? The body. So go ahead and add it now. You can write whatever you want as the text inside the paragraph element. I'm going to write testing out a new CSS property. Now add the style attribute. Remember, our attributes always go inside the opening tag and they consist of the attribute name, in this case style, followed by an equal sign, no spaces, and then a pair of double quotes. And our attribute value goes inside those double quotes. What are we going to use as our value? In this case, our value is a CSS declaration. We're going to use text decoration line as our property, followed by a colon, and then underline as our value, and finish it with a semicolon. Click the Run button and notice what happens. Our paragraph text is underlined. But what would happen if we make one more paragraph element? Would it be underlined too? Let's make a second one. Again, you can write whatever text you want inside of it. I'll write second example as the text inside of this one. Hit the Run button, and it looks like we have no underline on this one. But that makes sense, right? We didn't add a style attribute to this second paragraph element. So if we want the second paragraph also underlined, we'd need to add a style attribute to that one as well. But that's kind of annoying, right? Wouldn't it be nice if we didn't have to type out the style attribute on both of these? What if we could write it only once and have it work for both of them? And that leads us to our next concept, CSS rules. CSS rules allow us to apply as many styles as we want to one or more elements at the same time. This is how we'll be doing all our styling from now on. Rules start with a selector. We'll talk a ton about selectors in the next few lessons. The one that you see in this example here is called the type selector. It's the most basic form of selector, and it consists of only an HTML element name. Then the selector is followed by left and right curly brackets. All of our CSS declarations go inside these curly brackets. In this case, we only have one declaration, the text decoration line property and value that we were using earlier. So what exactly does this rule do? It tells the browser to first find all of the paragraph elements on the page, then apply all of the CSS declarations from inside the curly brackets to those paragraph elements. So now we know we can use a CSS rule to style both of our paragraph elements. But where do we write the rule? One of two places. The first place we can write our CSS rules is inside of an HTML style element. The browser will automatically apply any CSS rules from inside of a style element to the entire web page. Flip back over to Replit and let's try it out. First, go ahead and delete the style attribute off the paragraph element. Then hit the Run button. We should now have two paragraphs and neither of them are underlined. Now add a style element. This can be anywhere on the page, but the best practice is to put them at the top. Inside that style element, let's write our CSS rule. The rule always starts with a selector, and again we'll learn a ton more about selectors in the next lesson. For now, we're using something called a type selector, and it will consist of only the element name. In this case, the letter P for paragraph element. The P is followed by a pair of curly brackets, and then hit enter to give us some space inside of the curlies. Next, type our CSS declaration. Remember, that's the property and value pair. So text decoration line, then a colon, then underline, and finally a semicolon. Hit the Run button, and success! The CSS rule has applied to every paragraph element on the web page. Try making one more paragraph element to be sure. I'll make a third one with the text, "This is lit, fam." Press the Run button, and now it applies to the third paragraph as well. Finally, remember how I said we could put as many CSS declarations as we want inside of the CSS rule? Let's test it. Inside our rule and beneath the first declaration, add a second one. Let's use the CSS color property and set the value to red. Go ahead and hit the Run button one last time. Nice work. We've now applied multiple styles to multiple elements at the same time using CSS rules. Okay, but earlier I said there were two places that we could write our CSS rules. Where's the second one? It's CSS files. CSS files are completely separate files from our HTML files. Writing CSS rules in their own separate CSS file is recommended, and it's how we'll be doing our styling for the rest of the course. So let's flip back over to Replit and see how it works. On the file bar on the left side of Replit, go ahead and make a new CSS file. We'll call this one style.css. Cut your CSS rule out of the style element and paste it into the CSS file. Now delete the rest of your style element. Finally, hit the Run button. Uh-oh, it doesn't appear to be working anymore. What do you think went wrong? Well, our HTML file actually has no idea that it's sitting next to a CSS file. Our HTML file is pretty dumb, and it can't find the CSS file on its own. We have to tell it to load and use the CSS file. And that's where the link element comes into play. Remember the link element from our lesson on the head of the HTML document? The link element can be used to link HTML files and CSS files together so that the styles apply to the HTML document. The link element is a void element, and it has a couple important attributes that we need right now. href, which will be a file path or a web address to our style sheet, and rel, which is short for relation and should always be set to style sheet whenever we're linking CSS files. There's a bunch of other options for rel, but we won't get into them this lesson, and you can look them up on your own time if you'd like. Flip over to Replit and let's try out this link element. In the head of your document, go ahead and add a link element. For the href attribute, use a value of style.css, which is the name of our CSS file. For the rel attribute, use a value of stylesheet. Now hit the Run button and see what happens. Those paragraphs look underlined to me. Nice work. You've successfully separated your CSS from your HTML. This will be super important as we start building more complex web pages and websites. By keeping CSS separate from HTML, we'll have a much easier time staying organized and making changes later on. There's two last things I want to quickly mention: CSS comments and proprietary properties. CSS comments allow us to leave notes for ourselves in CSS files. The syntax for a comment looks like this: a slash and then a star symbol, then our note, followed by a star symbol and a slash to end the note. Let's try it out quickly in Replit. Above your CSS rule in your style.css file, go ahead and add a comment. Start with a slash and then a star, then some text. Then end it with a star followed by a slash. Nice work. Okay, that was comments. Now what are proprietary properties? Well, proprietary properties are CSS properties that typically only work in a single web browser. You might also hear them called vendor prefixes or CSS prefixes. They aren't used as much anymore, but historically, new CSS properties were added to browsers with a prefix in front of the property for testing purposes. You can see some examples on this slide. When new CSS properties were proposed, the programmers in charge of updating the web browsers would all implement the new CSS properties at different speeds. usually because they were already working on something else at the time. So the prefixes were a way for web developers like you and me to test out new CSS features in a single browser like Safari or Chrome before it was ready for all of them. Basically, anything experimental had a prefix added to the beginning of it. Some of the proprietary properties eventually became standard in all web browsers and their prefixes were removed. Other proprietary properties still exist, but are no longer going to be added to the CSS standards, so using them is discouraged. Nowadays, browsers are moving away from using prefixes for new and experimental CSS. But you might still see these prefixes in old code, so it's important to understand why they were used. Alright, that's it for this lesson. Flip on over to the next one.